we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us live today and for viewing the recording on demand afterwards. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us here. So this is part 3 of our webinar series on format compliance, the EARS patterns, and requirement best practices. If you haven't viewed the first 2 webinars and are interested, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to share those links. The first webinar introduced format compliance and why it is often a requirement in requirement writing. And the second webinar dove deeper into the EARS patterns and demonstrated how you can leverage QVscribe to ensure that your requirements conform to the EARS patterns. We'll have a question period at the end, but please feel free to add some questions throughout. If it makes sense to answer them as we go, then we will. And if not, then we'll make sure we get to them at the end. So today we are going to be summarizing the importance of format compliance and the benefits of the EARS patterns, and then discuss how other tools and techniques can combine with EARS to create a more well-defined, reliable requirement process. We'll also be taking more time to show you our software, QVscribe, and discuss how it can help you to ensure understanding and adherence to EARS and other industry best practices and rule sets. Beyond these webinars that you have hopefully been attending or watching on demand, we have a number of resources on EARS, industry-specific guides for writing requirements, and many other resources on how to create clear, consistent, verifiable requirements. Please check out our website, qracorp.com, or reach out to us and we'd be happy to share. So a bit more about us. We are QRA Corp. We are based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, which you can see a nice aerial view of on the slide here. We started with a formal analyzer for model-based design within the aerospace defense industry with our first tool that was called QVtrace. We were looking for perfect storm scenarios within models until we realized that many of the errors that we were identifying within these models were a result of poorly defined requirements. Unclear requirements led to poorly built models, which led to a significant number of issues. So we looked to the market to find a complementary tool to assist our customers with the requirement development, and it didn't really exist. So we decided to build one, which became our second tool, and the one that you will see in detail today, QVscribe. Over the upcoming years, we found out what the market already knew, that a large percentage of issues being identified at all project stages were originating within poorly defined requirements. We focused more and more attention on QVscribe, and that is where most of our attention has been for the last 7 years. With the importance of requirements to so many industries, we now have QVscribe users among industry leaders in all safety critical, complex engineering industries. This would include oil and energy, defense and space, automotive, transportation, government, aerospace, consulting, and medical devices. So to introduce the team that we have here today, Danielle Power is our onboarding and training manager. She ensures all of our users can fully implement QVscribe into their workflow and properly understand how to leverage it. Working on the post-sales side and following customers as they improve their processes through format compliance technique like EARS, defining best practices, and ensuring adherence through QVscribe, Danielle has seen firsthand the huge differences that these resources can provide. I'm Justin Tweed, account executive working on the pre-sales side. So my experience is with customers that are looking to make improvements to the requirement process and overall development process. They're typically running into project delays, verification issues, misinterpretation of unclear requirements, and numerous other issues that can be alleviated by a well-defined requirement process aided by our software, QVscribe. If you've been following our webinar series, you'll see a new face today. We're excited to welcome Morgan Costle to the QRA team. Morgan has recently joined our team as a customer success manager. She has prior experience working in technical sales and support for customers in the neurotechnology and security industries, and has also worked as a research device vendor, all of which has given her a unique perspective when it comes to requirement writing. Her role at QRA is to provide an outstanding customer experience to teams who are incorporating QVscribe into their workflow, training so that users can confidently and efficiently use our tool, and ultimately work with you so QVscribe can best address your business goals, challenges, and objectives. So who are you? This discussion can really benefit you no matter what stage of your requirement journey that you are. Whether you're a process authority looking for standards to implement across your organization to ensure that everyone is on the same page, so you can ensure that your processes will be predictable and repeatable, or a requirement leader who is looking for ways to help their team out with the complex task of efficiently creating high quality requirements. and ensuring that they can meet the strict timelines and cost expectations of projects. Or a requirement author who is looking for ways to take some of the complexity out of their role and looking to stand out from the crowd with the quality and efficiency of their work. Today, we're going to be summarizing and reiterating the benefits of format compliance, and specifically the EARS patterns, as a way to ensure that your requirements are always structured the same, no matter who is creating them. We'll then introduce more tools and techniques that can assist you in defining your organization's process for creating good requirements. And then Morgan will show you how QVscribe can assist you in ensuring that your team can understand and ensure adherence to these best practices, tools, and techniques. With that, I'll pass it over to Danielle.
Great, thank you, Justin. So thank you everyone for joining. Today we're going to discuss kind of an essentially round up our discussion around EARS, which is the easy approach to requirement syntax for anyone who, maybe this is their first webinar joining us. So if you haven't been to our other EARS webinars, we recommend taking a look. Please reach out to us after the webinar for links and if you're interested. Today I'll be providing a summary of our discussions in those webinars. We really want to kind of emphasize and highlight the benefits of EARS templates and format compliance as a whole. So kind of let's set the stage here. The purpose of requirement engineering is to ensure that a product or a system meets the needs and the needs of stakeholders, is delivered on time, within budget, and with high quality. So although this may seem like a pretty straightforward activity, it gets extremely complex as we start taking into account all the variables at play and how they evolve over time. So here at QRA, we champion precision in requirement writing through methods to streamline and enhance the requirement process and requirement engineering. So we work with some of the most advanced requirement writing teams, and we can assure you that like no two developments are the same when we're talking about the scale of it, complexity, risk, and the composition of the project team. They all are going to vary depending on the project and the companies. We can also assure you that the struggle with aligning on all of these moving pieces is felt no matter the size of the project, team, or company. So kind of due to this struggle with alignment and communication, there are quite a few common issues within requirement engineering process that a lot of our customers have noted. So you can see kind of right here, we've listed out a few that, can kind of problems that you can have, and a lot of different moving pieces when you're trying to align on a project. Some of the top ones that we've heard noted are lack of stakeholder engagement or misalignment of stakeholders, which then results with kind of ambiguous requirements and then results in changes in requirements at the later stage of the project. These common issues fall into kind of three common and probably top requirement issues that we see the most across project teams. So this is something we're going to be kind of taking a look at throughout this webinar. We're going to be looking at it from more of a perspective of how do you get complete requirements, how do you get clear requirements, and how do you get verifiable requirements. But for kind of the discussion around the common issues that we see and a little bit more about EARS, I'm going to kind of compare it to those common issues we mentioned. So the lack of stakeholder engagement, misalignment of stakeholders, this really aligns with kind of incompleteness. If there's issues with alignment and engagement from the stakeholders, there's obviously going to be an impact on the overall completeness of the requirements. So how can the requirement author accurately document requirements if they don't have the information they need, or there's contradicting information? It makes it very difficult to author when you don't have all of the information that you would need to kind of clearly and concisely get your point across. Ambiguous requirements are really going to fall into kind of unclear. These are going to be vague, and having vague requirements are very detrimental to projects. And the obvious impact is from the lack of stakeholder engagement or misalignment, you are more likely to introduce vague language or vague terms if you don't have all the information that you need. And then the last thing would be changes in requirements at a later stage of the project. So this is often due to requirements not being verifiable. Requirements that lack vital information or aren't aligned from the stakeholders are likely to be ambiguous, as I mentioned, and then likely will need to be changed at a later date. And the impact can be very detrimental, as I mentioned, to the projects. And this is if you're lucky enough to catch those problems at some point as well. So now that we understand kind of the issues, how can we mitigate it? From our experience, we recommend systemizing the requirement process as this is the most successful practice that we've seen among our customers. So you're going to be creating repeatable steps, executing those steps, and then building in a feedback loop. Your process will then begin to be repeatable and predictable, which is what kind of everyone wants. This lets teams tackle things that are not one-on-one. Sorry. This lets us tackle things not one at a time, but rather everything kind of like all together. So you're able to kind of come to alignment over the steps and processes instead of really just being kind of in chaos. So some of the common benefits we've seen to systemizing the process are kind of reduced errors that arose from misalignment, lack of communication, miscommunication, and so on. Reduced ambiguity because everything's clear, communicated exactly the same way to everyone. Everyone has an idea of what they can expect and what's expected of them and when. Increased consistency because everyone is on the same page. And lastly, improved quality of the project outcome because we start addressing the root causes and the issues that are threatening the quality of the projects. So with this kind of recommendation of really trying to systemize your process, one of the most recommended ways to begin systemizing your process is by implementing a requirement writing syntax. And this is where EARS comes in. So EARS is our QVscribe's kind of recommended format compliant standard. It is one that we have implemented directly in our tool. And it's one of the most used requirement writing syntaxes in requirement engineering. So EARS is going to provide a framework to authors so they can focus more on the content rather than the structure of the requirement itself. So just as a reminder, here are the EARS templates. So these are the basic templates. In our previous webinars, we did walk through some examples of how to kind of write these. Note that there are also complex templates, which we went into detail on webinar 2. These support the writing of requirements that become more specific and well-defined. So if we're writing about an optional feature, let's say it's, likely that we need to consider how the system will respond when we have this optional feature, but we also have maybe some unwanted behavior. So really, essentially the complex templates connect multiple templates together to ensure you can be more specific while still following kind of a logical structure. And kind of back to what we were saying about the standardization. Standardization of requirement syntax such as EARS can help with quicker reviews while avoiding common pitfalls like ambiguity, being overly wordy, and lack of singularity. So one thing that we spoke in detail about in our last webinar was feedback that we've heard from our customers who have implemented EARS. And here are some of the kind of benefits we've heard from our customers who use and some even mandate the use of EARS. So the first is structured guidance. So essentially having some sort of template or syntax structure as a guide is going to greatly simplify the authoring process for writing natural language requirements. EARS sets clear expectations for authors and readers of requirements. This helps create awareness of what type of information should be conveyed in a requirement and leads to a very concise output. So often when we're trying to improve something, or we're getting a poorly written requirement in front of us, we tend to add to it. We make it larger, we add more detail. EARS guides writers to use simple, efficient format. So it's basically going to eliminate the temptation to add extra information or words because the patterns just won't allow for it. Next would be having kind of high quality requirements. So EARS syntax helps users write requirements that are very streamlined and ambiguous and leaves little room for the common issues. The results of using EARS are that requirements are very similar to each other in format, even if they are written by different people. So the purpose of written requirement is to get the meaning into the reader's head as quickly as possible. When requirements are in a form that the reader is familiar with, they're easy to understand. So I know for me, for example, I see the word when, automatically I know, okay, that's an event-driven requirement. The ability to kind of grasp the requirement is going to be a lot faster. I'm going to know the direction that we're going in. The next would be decreasing review time. So agreement and layout of expected requirement structure doesn't just help the authors, as I mentioned, it's extremely helpful for the reviewers and readers. Usually, even when the first word onwards, as I mentioned, that word when comes up, reviewers know if they're reading an event-driven requirement, or if we see the word while, we're going to see that's a state-driven requirement. So this means that the main review time is spent on alignment with the contents or the components of the requirement rather than trying to understand the point or the goal of the requirement as a whole. And lastly, it is easy to implement. So the use of EARS requires very limited training to improve requirement authoring dramatically. Often teams just start using EARS templates directly in our tool, QVscribe. The majority of the effort is really spent on kind of practice and being consistent with the usage over time. And what we've seen is with some follow-up coaching, the techniques are quickly mastered and can transform an organization's requirement engineering culture. So that is kind of a high-level review of what we've done for EARS and what we've really looked at. These benefits are going to kind of emphasize the value of implementing EARS and format compliance into your requirement engineering process. Now, EARS and format compliance are a great first step towards creating complete, clear, and verifiable requirements. I will now hand it over to Justin, who will discuss additional tools and techniques that complement EARS in building a well-defined and reliable requirement process.
Great, thanks, Danielle. So to talk about some additional techniques, practices, tools, resources out there, first we need to talk about what makes a good high-quality requirement. And really, there's no clear definition of what makes a good high-quality requirement. But ironically, this is why it's so important to define what makes a good high-quality requirement for your organization or specific team. Of course, the most detrimental reason that teams come to us looking to improve their requirement process is because they've had significant time or cost impacts due to poorly defined requirements on their projects. But a frequent source of frustration that leads individuals or teams to look into improving their requirement process is that there's just too much subjectivity and time wasted debating the quality of their requirements and rewriting requirements over and over due to differing opinions. By defining the characteristics of a good requirement before starting the gathering, definition, translation process, you can create objective guidelines for requirement creators. You can limit subjectivity in review, and you can ensure a better understanding throughout development. So just as EARS allows you to ensure consistent formatting, there are best practices and tools available to ensure consistent terminology, clarity, and overall quality of requirements. So as we've already mentioned, there's no clear definition of what makes a good requirement, but these three characteristics, as Danielle has already mentioned, are pretty unanimously agreed upon as absolute musts and requirements, regardless of your industry. That being, the requirements must be complete, clear, and verifiable. So complete. A requirement statement needs to be made in its entirety. You can never omit information or assume it to be logical. We often hear of incidents where a third-party organization who avoided completing a certain aspect of what was expected of them because the requirements didn't expressly state that it was their responsibility or that they thought it was an optional feature. This, of course, can lead to contract disputes, timeline and cost overruns, and legal issues. This is why if something must be done, it is crucial that you make that clear. Additionally, a requirement shouldn't be overcomplete. Ensuring a requirement is singular, atomic, and doesn't include additional unnecessary language is crucial, as this can lead to just as much confusion as omitted language. This is certainly an area where EARS offers a lot of assistance, but different tools and techniques can offer additional process confidence. Clear. So if everyone who needs to interact with a requirement can't properly understand a requirement, that's a problem. We all have an internal bias. It's easy to understand what we've said or written, and is often difficult to comprehend where others may see that situation differently. Of course, the nature of our globalized world is that on projects, we have people coming from different professional backgrounds, different societal backgrounds, and different language backgrounds, and they're all contributing to the same project. This makes picking the best language to convey what it is that you are trying to convey a very difficult task. This is an area where additional tools tend to offer more than just EARS alone, as they can help you to overcome this personal understanding bias and identify the best language to use within the EARS pattern that you have opted for. Verifiable. So for a lot of industries that we work with, it is required by industry regulations to have a mechanism to ensure that a requirement is verifiable. Oftentimes, we see projects make it through to the verification stage before it becomes clear that it can't be verified. Sometimes this means simply rewording a requirement, but sometimes it means taking multiple steps back, involving a number of groups, and changing multiple degrees of work that have already been completed. Either way, with the importance of verification, it is crucial to ensure that a requirement is able to be verified at the earliest stage of the project cycle. In the worst cases, we've seen projects and products being released before issues are found and resulting in recalls and lawsuits. So ensuring a requirement is complete, clear, and verifiable should be the bare minimum for defining your requirement process. Next slide, please, Danielle. Thank you. So it's been found that over 50% of project issues are actually originating in poorly defined requirements. And with requirements obviously playing such a huge role in every stage of development, if these issues aren't identified early, then they can compile and get harder and harder to resolve the further down the process that they're able to go unnoticed. So as a result of this, these are some of the major issues that we see amongst our customer base. That being that there's delays in procurement, there's project cost increases, people are buying the wrong thing, pricing is inflated, they're not discovering risk, and then they're wasting time as well. Ensuring requirements are complete, clear, and verifiable, and whatever other standards that you would like to enforce helps to avoid these issues and keep with budget and timeline expectations. So a quick customer story. One of our oldest customers in the oil and gas industry, as a result of poorly defined requirements, they wound up with billions of dollars in overruns and many of the negative impacts that you see here. By the way that their requirements were written, they had two subcontractors that both assumed that the other was responsible for a critical component that was connecting two systems that were transferring crude oil. Production started at sea until they realized that the two systems couldn't connect. So the entire operation had to halt while they waited for the additional component to be manufactured and delivered. And in the end, the platform was significantly delayed for years. This cost the company billions of dollars, and it forced them to make significant investments into ensuring their requirements were high quality and clear from the start. So let's talk about how to get there. How do you define a good quality requirement? Next slide, please, Danielle. Perfect. So there's a number of best practices out there. At the bare minimum, every industry is going to have some degree of industry regulations, and your requirements need to meet the regulations laid out by your industry. Sometimes there's multiple, sometimes there's just one. It's going to be different for every industry, and knowing and understanding these rules is a key step to creating high quality requirements. You then have groups like the International Institute of Business Analysis, the IIBA, and the International Council on System Engineering, INCOSE, who've put together guidelines on how to write good requirements. These are industry agnostic. There's teams across a variety of industries leveraging these to ensure high quality requirements. Some groups take them at their face value, while others are adjusting them, making tweaks, and omitting certain rules to create the process that they would like to enact. And we'll go over some of those rules momentarily here. Standardized formatting. Of course, we've covered this in significant detail over the past number of webinars here, but patterns like those introduced in EARS make it much, much easier to ensure that a requirement is complete, clear, and verifiable. It's also important to know which rules to apply and when. Whether you're making your own rules or using predefined ones, as we'll introduce in a moment here, it's important to be flexible and understand when certain rules should be omitted or when you should actually add to them. Whether that means being less strict for high level requirements, like stakeholder requirements, and more strict when you're working with functional system level requirements, or just understanding when certain rules, including formatting like EARS, actually complicate a project more than they benefit it. We talked a bit about when not to use EARS in our first webinar in this series. And again, please reach out if you'd like to receive the link to any of the previous webinars. So let's take a look at the IIBA. They have created the Business Analyst Book of Knowledge, the BABOK, with the goal in mind of creating complete, clear, and verifiable requirements. They have expanded those into 9 rules for high quality requirements. That being that a requirement must be atomic, complete, consistent, concise, feasible, unambiguous, testable, prioritized, and understandable. Of course, this builds upon the 3 rules that we've introduced a number of times today. The thing with these issues is that they tend to compile and interrelate. An ambiguous requirement is typically not understandable, nor is it testable. But looking at these issues individually and breaking them into more specific groupings makes for easier analysis and working on correcting them. We'll move on to INCOSE now. INCOSE has the Guide for Writing Requirements, the GFWR. There we are. They've broken those rules further down into 41 rules for writing good requirements. So these are the most widely adopted guidelines, and they're also the best practices that we've actually used to create our quality analysis feature within our software QVscribe, which Morgan will be showing you in a moment. The benefit of more rules is that it makes it more likely that a rule is understood. It could be said that our statement of saying that a requirement must be complete, clear, and verifiable is in itself incomplete, unclear, and unverifiable. Of course, as requirement engineers, we're all very particular on the wording. So breaking this down into 41 rules makes it pretty clear what each of these rules means. But on the other hand, is it a potentially information overload that will either overwhelm, be forgotten, or be ignored altogether? These are the important things to consider when defining the rules that you want your team to follow. And of course, to reiterate the importance of flexibility in when to enforce more or less rules. So for the next slide here, please, Danielle. So after you define what a good requirement means to your team and organization, the next crucial piece is to ensure that those rules are being understood and adhered to. So typically this means manual review led by your most experienced engineers, painstakingly reading over some, if not all, new requirements to ensure that they follow the best practices that you have specified your requirements need to follow. Of course, there's a number of problems with this. First, these reviews typically require the involvement of your most experienced, highest paid engineers. This pulls them away from their regular duties that they were hired to do for hours, days, or more. In all of our years working in the requirement space, we have never once come across an engineer who raves about how much they love to do requirement review. Typically, it's the opposite. We hear people speak of them being a waste of time and how they'd be preferring to do their actual duties that they were hired to do. Second, there will always be subjectivity. Although defining the rules, best practices, acceptable terms, etc., will help to eliminate a good chunk of subjectivity in requirement review, it will certainly not eliminate it altogether. Engineers are incredibly intelligent and rightfully opinionated when it comes to the way that things should be done. When it comes to the content of requirements, this is incredibly important. When it comes to the semantics, this can often lead to wasted time in manual review and sometimes unnecessary rework. Third, the risk of human error is very prominent in manual review. These are long, intense, truthfully somewhat boring sessions that can ultimately lead to some major requirement issues being overlooked. This is especially true with newly introduced best practices that may not be fully ingrained in people's memories yet. This can lead to these issues going undiscovered and creating compiling problems throughout development, as we previously discussed. Next slide, please, Danielle. So this is where our software QVscribe proves to be advantageous. So put quite simply, QVscribe automates the aspects of requirement engineering that a computer can do better to complement the requirement engineer, allowing them to focus on the creative aspects of a project that a human can do better. QVscribe integrates the best practices into the requirement creation process, highlighting requirement language that will prevent a requirement from being complete, clear, and verifiable, and providing the guidance to empower these engineers to make those required changes. Next slide, please. So QVscribe in turn empowers all engineers to contribute to the requirement improvement process, which significantly lessens review times and the workload placed on your most experienced engineers. It reduces subjectivity by allowing you to integrate your rules and best practices into the earliest stage of requirement creation and make that information readily available to everyone. And it mitigates the risk of human error by automatically highlighting best practice violations and bringing them to the forefront. Next slide, please, Danielle. So one more customer story here. We worked with a Canadian government organization. They had the goal of decreasing the time that they spent on requirements while also increasing the quality of their requirements. They realized that this goal would be nearly impossible to meet without outside assistance, so they opted to adopt our software, QVscribe. And in doing so, they were able to ensure requirements best practices were being followed as requirements were being created, and that quality was able to be improved by the engineers who were creating the requirements themselves. In turn, they were able to decrease their average review sessions from 1 week down to 1 day. So one more slide here, Danielle. We're going to show you the 3 main functions of QVscribe today that highlight how QVscribe can assist your team to enforce and ensure confidence in creating complete, clear, verifiable requirements. So Morgan's going to show you our quality analysis feature. This gives a risk-based score to each requirement, judging it based on the chance of it being unclear to the reader or anybody who needs to interact with the requirement, or not testable. It's too vague to be proven, unverifiable. Our consistency and similarity feature don't say this requirement is good or this requirement is bad. What they do is group like requirements together and give you a better angle, better lens to make these decisions for yourself. Consistency is pulling out all of the terms and units that have been used within a requirement document, and it ensures that you're being consistent on the terminology that you're using for your how you're referring to your objects throughout, and also that you're staying within the same system of units. Similarity is comparing a requirement to a requirement, and it's helping you to identify where there may actually be duplications or contradictions within your workflow. So with that, I will pass it along to Morgan, who's going to show you how QVscribe can help you to improve your requirement process.
Danielle and Justin for the lovely introduction. For those of you who have already seen the previous webinars in this series, you've already had a fantastic overview of QVscribe from Danielle and learned more about the ears integration and how the connections in Polarian and IBM Doors Next Generation look and feel. Today, we're going to be building off of everything we've touched on and shown so far about the ears templates and conformance in QVscribe, and address how QVscribe can be further utilized in your workflow to mitigate those risks, specifically when it comes to making sure that your requirements are verifiable, clear, and complete. In this part of the webinar series, I'm going to highlight our integration with Jama and show you some examples of how you can identify requirements that don't meet these conditions, and then how you can modify them so that they do. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. There we go. So I'm already logged into Jama and QVscribe, but by clicking here, you can go ahead and open a summary dashboard of everything that has been analyzed by QVscribe and see an overview of the features that are available. Before I get too deep into this, I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen and all the font is sized correctly. If there's any issues with it, just write it in the chat. I will take silence as a good to go. So the example that I'm using today is a pacemaker system specification. And to really build off of everything that Justin and Danielle have talked about so far, I'm going to start with how you can check to make sure that your requirements are verifiable using QVscribe's quality analysis. Some common signs that a requirement is unverifiable are that they include optional escape clauses, superfluous infinitives, non-specific temporal words, and immeasurable quantification. So first, what I'm going to do is filter my requirements by those where a non-specific temporal word has been detected. As you can see, and as Justin touched on very briefly before I started sharing my screen, these requirements are given a score of 1 to 5 to determine the quality of the requirement, with 1 being a very high risk requirement. Next, I'm going to sort my requirements by low to high score to see what one will work on today. Immediately, what draws my attention here is requirement 168, which has a score of 1 out of 5. Let's take a look at how I can go ahead and increase this score. While in duration delay mode, when ATR detection algorithm determines that atrial tachycardia is over, the system shall enter pace now mode immediately and fallback shall be avoided. This currently has a score of 1 out of 5. And you can see in the alerts here, everything that is factored into that score. It contains multiple uses of the imperative shall, as highlighted here, and here, and here. It also has the non-specific temporal word immediately. And both of these impact the requirement verifiability. We also have a quality warning here of the passive voice, but that doesn't actually impact the quality score here, as it's very context dependent as to whether or not passive voice is being used correctly. Please think of this as more of an FYI rather than something being inherently flagged as wrong. That being said, some organizations do prohibit the use of passive voice altogether, so that's why there really still is that human component of requirements writing, as additional information is needed to make a correct call. Finally, you can see that an EARS complex state-driven, event-driven format has been detected. However, in its current state, it's not compliant in this requirement. Now, how do we go about fixing this requirement? To respect the status and edit permissions in Jama, any requirements in this view of QVscribe can't be edited. However, you can just go ahead and open the requirement here. And if it is open to be edited, you can go ahead and make changes by clicking edit and going down to the description. Here you can also see a QVscribe icon in this editing box. That's called the score scan, and any changes made to this requirement will adjust the score in real time. So first, let's start by making this requirement EARS compliant. By switching to the pace now mode, fallback is already avoided, so we don't actually need this statement about fallback in the requirement. So let's go ahead and delete it altogether. Then, as you can see, that score has been changed in real time. We get that feedback, and we've changed the requirement from being a 1 out of 5 to a 3 out of 5, which means we're almost there. Next, I'm going to click the score scan icon to open the requirement in what we call authoring view, just to refresh my memory on what outstanding items we need to address. Perfect. So, success. We see here that we are now EARS compliant to the state-driven, event-driven complex format. By utilizing the format compliance, we have also removed the alert of the multiple imperatives that was impacting the score. And in this instance, we also removed that passive voice warning. However, there is still that issue of the non-specific temporal word. This is a fantastic example of how implementing EARS greatly impacts the quality of your requirements writing. However, sometimes there are additional best practices and techniques needed to further improve the quality of your requirement. In this case, our requirement still isn't verifiable. So let's get back to editing. The non-specific temporal word that's causing us a lot of trouble here is the word immediately, as outlined here and here. This is because, well, immediately is impossible, and nothing is ever actually immediately. Second, immediately, what does it really even mean? Even if you were using it, it could mean something very different to me, to you, to whoever is reviewing or testing this requirement. It is not repeatable nor testable. Therefore, it's not verifiable. For the purposes of this webinar, let's say that I want the system to enter paste now mode within 200 milliseconds. I'm going to edit this requirement. Perfect. Now we have a requirement that has that 5 out of 5 score and is EARS compliant and is considered verifiable. You can also see that QVscribe has detected a unit now that we've added the 200 milliseconds in there, saying that there is something we might want to check out with the unit consistency across the document. Let's now explore the consistency analysis in QVscribe to see how that can help you make sure that your requirements are clear. So since we were just talking about 200 milliseconds, I'm going to start with the unit consistency. However, broadly, the consistency analysis does cover both unit and term consistency. And unlike the quality analysis section of QVscribe, this considers the whole set of requirements as opposed to the individual level. Here, you can get a quick snapshot of all the units that have been detected in this system specification. It allows you to quickly see if there are any units in there that shouldn't be, or maybe see if the units are following a certain standard, like the International System of Units, or see if they're inconsistent with the International System of Units. You can also see whether there are any contradicting units, like pounds versus kilograms, or kilometers versus miles, which may be impacting your requirement's clarity. Next, we will take a look at the term consistency. This detects all of the nouns and noun phrases in the system specification and can be used to ensure that consistent terminology is used throughout. Please do note that this is case sensitive. So if you have capital A ability and lowercase a ability used throughout your document, they will be detected as different terms, but with very high similarity. Where this becomes really useful is if you have different terms referring to the exact same thing. For example, if I sort this by most occurrences, I can see that there are 26 occurrences of the term device. However, this is a system specification for a pacemaker. So if I type that in here, I see that there's also occurrences of the term pacemaker. These are very likely referring to the exact same thing and impact the clarity of the system specification. Now, if I wanted to, I can go in to see the instances of pacemaker and then open them and edit it so that we make sure the term device is being used instead. QVscribe really helps to identify potential uncontrolled terms in documents like this one where there's 187 requirements, or even larger ones where there's hundreds or thousands of requirements, where it would be quite time-consuming to manually comb through and find all of these nouns and noun phrases. Next, we will dive into the ways that you can look for issues in completeness by using QVscribe's similarity analysis. Just like the consistency analysis, this is looking at things at the whole set and comparing and contrasting the requirements to one another. This allows you to see if there are any potential duplications or contradictions. You're able to then sort them by order of appearance, number of similar, or the highest percent match. When we sort by the highest percent match, you can see that there is requirement 69 and 55 that are having that 100% match. Let's take a look by clicking at the requirement. And you can see a nice comparison of the two requirements in question. And once again, reiterating that there's 100% match in their similarity. But the question is why? Why are we seeing this exact same requirement listed twice in this document? Let's go back to Jama and take a look. So as I look at the context around the requirement, I find requirement 55, and I can see that the requirements around it are referring to a pace now pace parameter. And likewise, if I go down to requirement 69, I can see that those around it are referring to the POR pace parameter. This is likely two requirements that fall under two different parameters. But in order to be understood, all of the information that the reader needs should really be included in the requirement. You shouldn't need to go look for more context around the requirement to be able to understand it. the requirement should be able to be removed from the document and be complete enough that it can make sense on its own. Manually checking for potential duplications and contradictions can be very time-consuming. I'm quite lucky in that requirement 55 and 69 are only 14 apart, but QVscribe similarity analysis will help with requirements even 100 or 1,000 apart. Then, just as I just showed, you can easily navigate to the requirement to see what kind of missing information is needed to be added to make these requirements complete, ultimately saving time in your workflow. Finally, you have access to our well-defined and clear configurations in QVscribe, which make it so much easier to write requirements. We do understand that industries and companies are different. You may have different standards and rule sets that you're working from. One of the great things about QVscribe is that it can be configured to match your needs of your organization. For example, if there are certain problem types that aren't required by your organization, you can just go ahead and toggle them off. Another example is if that your organization only permits for the imperative shall, you can just go ahead and remove all of the other ones that are approved so that only shall remains. So that's the only imperative that is allowed in your system specification. There also may be different rule sets for different projects. With QVscribe, you can utilize that automation of the software to create and save different configurations with unique rule sets and problem types. These are just a few examples of how QVscribe can be utilized to create those complete, clear, and verifiable requirements. However, there are quite a few different best practices and techniques that we just don't have time to cover today. It's often easy to write a bad requirement and hard to write a good requirement. But with QVscribe, it really makes it easy to write a good requirement and hard to write a bad one. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us after this webinar if you would like to see more of the capabilities of QVscribe, and we would be more than happy to show you and see what specific configurations and approaches may be the best fit for your organization. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Morgan. Yeah, so that's a more detailed look at some of the functionality of QVscribe. As you can see on your screen here, so Morgan was software looks within Jama Connect today, but we actually do have integrations directly into Doors Next, Polarian, and then we interface with most other requirement management softwares via our integrations for QVscribe for Microsoft Word and Excel. So again, if you do have any interest in learning a little bit more, please reach out to us afterwards, and we'd be happy to talk about your unique situation. We did have a few questions come through. We've got about 10 minutes left here, so we'll try to get as many as possible. So the first question I have here, can you provide what you think is a common issue that may not be considered a problem until it's too late? Danielle, do you want to touch on that? Seems like something that you may come across in some of your training exercises.
Yeah. Maybe just kind of thinking back to what Morgan last kind of went through around those two similar requirements. Something that's comes up quite often and is something we actually have in our latest newsletter is around atomic requirements. So this could be either requirements in paragraph form, requirements not having all of the information that they need, or even very commonly what we see are bullet point requirements. This is a very common way that requirements are currently written, I would say a bit of a legacy way of doing things. We tend to write, if we were writing in Word documents, in paragraph form or bullet points to try to group things together. This may seem like something that when you're kind of going through the review process might not be a problem, but at later stages in the project, this can be very detrimental. How do you ensure that things are allocated properly? How do you verify things? If one of those points in the bullet point, there's an issue, you have to go back and you have to pull it out, and you have to be able to, how do you verify ensure that everything else isn't affected? So there's a lot of impacts if you don't write atomically. So that's what I would say is one that people understand the need for kind of a singular requirement structure, but really the impacts aren't really felt or aren't really noticed till later on.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Okay, so we've got another one here. Is there a risk, and if so, what is it, when only relying on ears or format compliance without taking a comprehensive view of the requirement? I can touch on this. I think that really the example that Morgan showed there in that first example of our quality analysis feature really emphasizes this really well, where ears provides a lot of guidance, and specifically ears, as it is a kind of our encouraged form of format compliance. It will make those crucial first steps. Of course, you're going to get the formatting the same across the organization, but you can also eliminate things like multiple imperatives. Just getting things in the right structure is going to ultimately avoid a significant number of issues. But of course, in that example that we had right there, ears isn't going to identify something like immediately. And how do you verify that something is happening immediately? You really can't. So there's certainly terminology that's not going to be identifiable by format compliance or ears, because it ultimately fits into the structure of the way that things need to go. But then beyond that, it's just ultimately something that's not going to be identified by, a structure in itself. So that's certainly where best practices and enforcing those across your organization are key, and specifically QVscribe, where, we'd like to say that it's the best way to ensure the adherence and ensure that you're, able to train that across your team with ease. So we have a few additional questions coming in here. We'll just take a moment and make sure that we pick the next one here. Does anybody have any of the questions that they'd like to cover? Okay, I don't see anyone hopping off. Okay, I see one here. Is ears only based off 5 templates or have more significance? So I believe what's being asked here is there, can there be additional templates to ears, or what else is there to ears? Ears is specifically those patterns. So, depending on what type of requirement you're writing, whether it's, specific for a specific situation, or it's whether it's a certain thing needs to happen to make this requirement be relevant, that is when you pick the specific pattern that you're looking to use. So basically, because of that, there's 5 main templates that will allow you to, again, identify a number of issues within your requirements, but also just create a standardized formatting across your organization that makes writing easier, it makes reviewing easier, and it makes implementing easier, because everybody understands that when I see a where, this is the type of requirement we're speaking of. When I see a when, this is the type of requirement we're speaking of. Speaking on the 5 base templates, there are also complex templates, because ultimately sometimes it will only be when something is in a certain state and then an event happens that a requirement will be relevant. So sometimes the patterns get combined into multiple and they create the complex templates. Again, that's something that we did cover in the second webinar in this series. So if you are interested in that, we'll pick up your name here and we'll make sure that we share that with you, and we can chat a little bit more in detail afterwards. Getting a lot of questions in here. Does anybody have any other ones that they saw come in while I was covering that last one? Crickets. Okay, I saw this one from earlier, so I'll cover another one here. Can you provide practical insights into how QVscribe integrates with existing requirements workflows? So I think that we didn't get into it in much detail, but what Morgan was able to show you at the end of her demo there was our configurability. So ultimately, as I mentioned in my piece, we encourage ears and we encourage the INCOSE guide for writing requirements as kind of the best industry agnostic resources out there to create well-defined requirement practice. Now, that being said, as I've also mentioned a number of times here, flexibility is key. And what the configurability of QVscribe offers you is that flexibility. So if you disagree with some of the terms that we've included in our list of violations, and this is based on INCOSE, but we've evolved this over our years working across a number of industries. We found terms that seem to be consistently problematic, and we've built that into the software as well. So you have 4 starting configurations based on kind of the level of requirements that you're working with within QVscribe, but you have free reign to make those changes as you see fit. Now, there are permission levels within the software to determine exactly who has the permission to make these changes, and that won't be going to every requirement author, but requirement leaders certainly will. They'll be able to determine that, okay, this term isn't problematic for us. Okay, we're only enforcing shall on this particular project, or okay, these terms are proving to be problematic. We need to add them to the software. This is just a one-click, type it in, and then it's in there. And what that really allows you to do is have that conversation one time, agree upon a thing that is either acceptable or unacceptable, needs to be omitted or needs to be included, and then ensure that happens across the board, and that information is readily available to all of your engineers. Okay, I think that with the number of questions that we're getting here and just 2 minutes left, what we'll do is just reach out to people afterwards. Thank you very much for adding so many questions. It's really great to see, and we really appreciate everybody's contributions today, of course, for being here and also to contributing for the conversation. So love to continue these conversations further after this. So we'll certainly make sure that we answer all of their questions in due time. But yeah, if you would like to continue the conversation with us, as we mentioned, we will get back to you on your questions here, but we would also love to connect with you, do a no obligation analysis of your requirements. We have a personalized solution that can integrate with your systems, as I just kind of discussed there. And then we can also follow the link in the follow-up email to schedule a call, and we can discuss your unique situation and how QVscribe could hopefully help your team. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and hopefully we see you again soon.